Okay, I want to talk about the importance of looking at disproportionality, and especially as we consider it and how we can measure it, because there's some ways that we can effectively measure what's going on in the schools that are commonly accepted, valid, and reliable, and a four-step problem solving. And we have a brief out that I'll talk about a little later on. First, on disproportionality. Disproportionality, well, some foundational statements first is we would make the case that we all got into this for the same reason. We wanted to help others do well. Okay? Our hearts were in the right place, and we've been trying to do so. For the most part, schools want good outcomes for all their kids, but and we wouldn't purposely leave anybody behind, but we know that what happens in reality is that certain groups of kids do get different outcomes than other groups of kids, which means they get different, disparate, or what we call disproportionate outcomes. And when we talk about that disproportionality, what we're really talking about is overrepresentation or underrepresentation from what we would expect for a group. If you're 25% of the group, you should get 25% of the good outcomes, probably have 25% of the bad outcomes. I'll guarantee you, because I do this with all over the nation, and there's very few places that have that kind of equitable outcome. When we look at this over here, we can see that, whoops, new cursor. We can see that here we have 16% of the population is responsible for 42% of the multiple referrals. And 16% of that population.
Don't walk past this way or else I lose you, so just stay here over there. Thank you so much.
Got it. Thank you. I don't know if you heard him, but he said, stay over here. Oh, I see who loses me. It's the camera that loses me. I think I'll move over here so I can see the screen then, because that speaker's right in my way. We can see that also that 31% of the population is responsible, or 16% of the population is responsible for 31% of the school-related arrests or referrals to law enforcement. Those aren't equitable. We would think that 16% would have 16% of the multiple, or 16% of the referrals to law enforcement. At the same time, we have underrepresentation because 51% of the population only sees 31% of those multiple suspensions. We see this overrepresentation a lot in identification for special education, discipline referrals, suspensions, expulsions. And we see underrepresentation when we look at different groups of students for identification for talented and gifted class, advanced placement opportunities, opportunities for resource access within the schools. So when we start talking about this and we start looking at it around discipline, what we see is we've been doing this for a long time. 1964 was the Civil Rights Act. 1964. We've got data here from research studies for the last 50 years looking at just the disproportionality in discipline, different outcomes for different groups of kids. And yet, we're still juggling these balls around this thing. And then when we come close to dealing with it, we have parts of the population that say, we're not ready to address this yet. 50 years. We've been studying it. We're not yet ready to address it. The Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights collects data on all the schools in the nation and the outcomes that they have. This goes back to the 13-14 data. And when we looked at that civil rights data collection showed that in a pre-K situations, African-American students had predominant part of all the school suspensions. Most of these students are male. That I guarantee you happens all the way through elementary, middle, high school. It's still predominantly male. Interestingly enough, children with disabilities and English language learners didn't see a disproportionate level of suspension from school at that level, the pre-K level. Later on, they certainly will. During that K-12, at the K-12 experience in public schools, about 2.8 million, almost 3 million students, about 6% of the population gets suspended from the schools annually. And we know that there are significant racial disparities, especially when we start looking at elementary schools and especially when we look at high schools. And predominantly males and children with disabilities, English language learners, and wherever there's a cross-section. Students of color that also have a disability or are male, or students of color that are male and have a disability, highly likely to have these significantly bad outcomes. We can look at that same data from the most recent one. They collect this every 2 years. Right now they're looking at the 17-18 data, and it'll be released next year. But when we released this earlier this fall, the 15-16 data showed that 2.7 million, hey, that's 100,000 better. We're making progress. So 5 to 6% were suspended one or more times. But look at 15% of the population in that was African American. But 22% of the students suspended for harassment or bullying, 39% of those suspended out of school, 31% of the students that were referred to law enforcement or subject to a school-related arrest, or 33% of those were expelled, were African American. 15% compared to those numbers. It is not equitable in all cases. Here it is, when a little bit further breakdown. Of that 15%, about 8% of those students are African American males. About 8% are African American females. But they represent 25% of the males that are suspended from school, and 14%. These don't. Look at it, 13 to 6, 24 to 8, 25 to 24, 13 to 15. Those look reasonable in somewhat, maybe underrepresentation in some cases, but somewhat similar. Not similar at all. And when we look at the same thing for expulsion, we get the same kind of outcomes. Right away, people start to go, well, maybe this is because these students are poor. Well, we know that socioeconomic status affects different groups differently, and students of color disproportionately. But when we control for poverty, when we say, look at all the high-income students and check across, or look at all the low-income students or check across, or any of the 5 strands in between and look across, what we know is race is still a predominant factor. Students of color are more likely to have significantly less or more negative outcomes. There's an unequal educational opportunity. Students of color are often limited by the poor facilities and the resources they can get access to. They're underrepresented in the curriculum. We don't see those same students in the curriculum like we do pictures of white students. They see fewer highly qualified teachers. They're more likely to be in a segregated school, even though we went through an era of desegregation. Some people say, well, you know, maybe it's just that these students behave differently. Except when we look at the behavior in students in school, we don't see a difference in the objective things. There's not a big difference in theft. There's not a big difference in possession. There's not a big difference in bullying. There's not a big difference in forgery. Those things that we see happening in school. Where we do see it, African American students and students of color are severely punished much more severely for less serious instances of behavior and much more subjective. Defiance, disrespect, and disruption. Somebody had to make a call shot. And they're making a different call shot for one student when they compared to another student. We use office discipline referrals, behavioral incident forms to kind of keep track of, and we can use that to describe what school climates look like, because we can tell what kind of activity, what kind of behaviors are happening in different schools. They also tell us who was involved, what happened, when did it happen, where did it happen, and sometimes they'll even tell us why. More importantly, they tell us the consequence. What was attributed to the student that did this? How did we take care of that? What did we do to help the student learn the lesson? Those can... God, I just noticed that. I don't know how many times I've had this slide. It's the first time I've ever seen that. There's no I. Now, that's what I do all the editing for all of our work. I couldn't catch that. That's interesting. That varies greatly for what that continuum of consequences are going to be. Some students, Billy, you know, that was so, I'm going to keep a record of that one. If it comes back up again, you and me, maybe mom and dad have a conversation about this. Well, right now, I'll just keep a track of it. Put it in the file, it goes away. Some other ones, though, maybe we need to bring Billy down and have him have a conversation with the counselor, the dean of students, the administrator, the principal, vice principal. He's talking to somebody. And sometimes we end up having that conversation with Billy's parents. And sometimes we attach some kind of compensatory thing to that. Part of that is, you know, you need to apologize. You need to make repair here, Billy. Sometimes we say, you know, you threw food in the cafeteria, now you can help Mr. Jones clean up the cafeteria. Things like that. Or maybe you no longer get to participate in this because you've been doing some things that we don't want you to do. We take away certain privileges. And sometimes we do the worst thing we can do to kids. We say, you don't get to be a part of the learning opportunity. You behave badly, and instead of learning about the behavior you're doing, we're going to say, you don't get to be here. The rest of us will be here. You don't get to be here. As a middle school principal for 15 years, I guarantee you there's times when that has to be the consequence. When you say, you just can't be here. I got to find some way. I want to bring you back and make you successful, help you be successful, but I can't have you here. So we even removing them from class or removing them from school or saying, you don't get to come to school anymore. We expel them. And what we know is those actions disproportionately affect students of color. They lead to negative outcomes, lower academic achievement, reduced graduation rate and promotion rate, likelihood of dropping out of school, connection to the juvenile justice system. By the way, I didn't mention this, but every one of these things where I quote things like that, there's the citation. You can download the bibliography. It's a complete bibliography with everything that's on here. So you can, they're all cited so you can look at them. Here's the information from the 13-14 scub year. Look at these as we go across here. We can see that if we make a line at the elementary level, the dark bars are the elementary level. These were students that were suspended one or more times out of school during the 13-14 school year. There's our white population, almost 2%, 1.6% of the students. But when we look at, African-American students, Native students, multiracial students, and students with disability have a much different outcome, much higher than the other students at elementary level. By the elementary level, 6th grade, we've already said, we're going to treat you different in society. I find it kind of sad. And when we look at the secondary level, now we're up to 4.7% of the white population is suspended out of school sometime during the 13-14 school year. This is all the schools in the nation, 4.7. But, wow, Hispanic students, black students, Native students, multiracial students, students with disability. Look at, this is, oops, that's a great one too. This is almost, a great one, come on. This is almost 4 times as much as this. This is 3 times as much as this. Significantly different consequences for different groups of students, and that's what disproportionality is all about. Here's an excellent one. I use this one in all because it's so easy to see. I use Nevada as an example because you have such big, you only have 17 districts in the state because they're big geographical areas. It makes it real easy to do the demonstration. But this dark color right here, 25% or greater of the students in that district were suspended out of school during the 2011. 25%, 1 in 4 students in your classroom got a suspension sometime during the classroom or sometime during that school year. 24%. And right next to that, we have 10 to 15%. And then that one's 5 to 10%. Did I leave one out? 15 to 25%, 10 to 15%, 5 to 10%. Almost 5% up in the large area there. African-American students. All students, African-American students. All students, that is horrific. That's so drastic. Look at the Southeast. Look at the Midwest. Look at the East Coast. Look at the West Coast. Look at right here in Nevada. More than 25% of our students are being suspended, our African-American students are being suspended out of school. And in a lot of places, we don't have 25% to have them suspended. We don't have enough students there. So if we're suspending them, it's a high likelihood that that's a lot of percentage of the students that are there. Well, I don't want to do that and just have you focus on, this is all these horrible things that's happening. Let me talk to you instead about some of the resources, some of the things we can do about it. First thing I want to point out is pbis.org. All things related to PBS, the research behind it. This is from the National Technical Assistance Center. I'll point out the same thing that Kent pointed out, and that is 25,911 schools. He actually had a higher number, and I'm wondering where he got it, but because I thought this was the latest number. This is one that's posted last week. Anyway, he might have the one where the State Departments add to it, but 25,000, that's more than a quarter. He said 28%, more than a quarter of all the nation's schools. 96,000 schools in the nation, 26,000 are implementing PBIS to some form. The largest non-mandated implementation effort in public education ever. The largest non-mandated. The largest mandated would be IDEA. They have the ability to say, everybody's going to do this, right? The feds can say that about special education. This is a choice. 1/4 of this nation's schools are saying, I want to do something different. We got a lot of things up here that we can select from, but today let's just look at the end of the school and drop down, and down at the bottom there's a place called Equity and PBIS, and when you open up that page, there's a whole bunch of other resources you can access. These are absolutely free. Just go in, download them, they're there and available for you. Two of them I want to point out. Both of these were originally written in 2014 in our effort to address this thing that's going on that we need to, as part of PBIS, be aware of and work towards doing something to improve this. The first one is, this one was rewritten last February. It's a 5-point intervention for approach to enhancing equity in school discipline. Look at number 1. Use disaggregated discipline data. We've mentioned several times in the presentations today about the importance of using discipline data. Disaggregate that data. Look at the data for one group compared to the group of another group. Implement school-wide PBIS. Use effective instruction. Her presentation this morning was outstanding in that regard. Have effective policies. Say that we are going to improve implementation of PBIS. We're going to require, he mentioned talking about in hiring, in job descriptions. How about in how we're going to behave in school? How about how the adults are going to behave in school? And reducing bias in our discipline decisions. There's things we can actually do about this. And there, right there is this important piece that says, given the well-documented negative effects that this has on a range of student outcomes, we must address this by 1, you need to identify the rates at which it's happening. 2, do something about it. And 3, monitor it to see if that worked. So really we're gonna measure the disproportionality, we're gonna intervene somehow, and we're gonna monitor the effects to see how those are working. We followed that document up a couple of months later with what we call the data guide. These are information for school teams to use, guide you through the use of the 4 metrics that I'm going to talk about in a minute. This also available absolutely for free. Just download it and get it. Another series, excellent series. Just Google Discipline Disparities series, and you'll get all these, choice of all these. You can download each one of these for free. Oops, go back one. This one, the overview, simply talks about the history and what disproportionality looks like in American schools today. Interventions there's a whole document, a research paper on just different things that you can do to intervene. Policy recommendations. If you're going to behave like this, you do not need to be in this profession. It can be that clear. New and developing research, acknowledging race. Turns out that if you will accept the fact that we probably have some implicit biases, that we have certain things that raise their ugly head sometimes, and we look at our data, we might be able to better address it. If you won't acknowledge it, chances of addressing it are pretty slim. And then what about the disparities for LGBTQ students? This one's a 2-page document, because when you sit down and start talking with anybody, somebody will always say, well, isn't this about, what about the common myths and the research facts behind the studies that have been done that dispute those myths or counter them all together? An excellent source of information. The Equity Project, anything that Russ Skiba is involved with out of Indiana University, and Mariella Donda, his partner, the things that they share. Russ Skiba and Dan Lowson out of the UCLA Civil Rights Project. Oops, go back, not one more. Tremendous presenters on this situation for all over the nation. And Dan Lowson is a leader in the school to prison pipeline and the things that happen related to this inequity and how it affects special education. Just came out last month. This is the newest document, and it really is talking about the 16-17 or the 15-16 data, the newest one. It's called Miseducation. If you Google in ProPublica, miseducation, You get this map of the United States like that other one, but it's interactive. You can look at the opportunities that students have, the things they're up against, discipline disparities, the obstacles they're up against, segregation in schools, and there's a whole other one that I'm forgetting right now. You can look at it and you can see what this looks like for the whole nation. Well, additionally, you can look and see what it looks like for every county, every district in your state. You can look at every school within your state to see what their metrics are around the same things that we're going to talk about in the next 4 metrics when we talk about. Absolutely free, Miseducation. It's interactive. It's a tremendous work site. You can choose, do I want to look at this especially focused on our African American students? Do I want to look at our Hispanic students? Or do I want to look on the outcomes for all the students? And again, information on all 96,000 public schools from all 17,000 districts in the nation. I would suggest that this is also a good site to get a lot of information from. A lot of it's free. There are some applications that cost money, but one of the ones he mentioned was PBIS assessment. If you click on that, PBIS assessment is absolutely free, and you should be using that simply to guide your implementation of PBIS throughout the districts, throughout your state. Okay, let's quickly, because I know I've got to get through these things. Okay, the 4-step problem-solving model, this is really based on that data guide. This is the same thing that we talk about in the data guide, and it really comes down to this. If you're going to look at this thing, you really need to determine, do we have a problem? We have to identify what that problem is, and then we have to figure out, well, what's going on? How do we look at that? So we analyze the information around that problem, and then we need to figure out what we're going to do. We plan some kind of intervention, and we implement that intervention with fidelity, and then we come back and check to see if that plan was working. We take that information and say, did we fix the problem? Do we still have a problem? And with disproportionality, you are most likely still going to have a problem. You may have tweaked it, you may have bumped it, you're most likely still going to have it, so what else are we going to do? And you're going to continue this circle on and on. Same thing we do in school. Billy is having trouble with 2-digit addition. He's not carrying. We look at it, we assess it, we figure it out. He's not carrying. We figure out what we're going to do, how we're going to reteach this ability. We do that, and then we evaluate how well it worked. Billy, you're much better. You're carrying most of the time, not all the time. Let's work on how we can help you be more fluent in this. Same thing we do with our students every day in school. Same way we do anything that we're trying to implement. Same kind of a thing. We look at it, we analyze it, we figure out what we're going to do, we implement it and say, how well did that work? Then we try to move on. When we're doing this, the first thing we do in identification, we need to measure something. And what we're measuring is, we're going to measure what something is and where we really want it to be. We determine a goal where we want it to be. And the difference between where I am and where I want to be is that performance gap. Well, when we're talking about disproportionality, we want to look at those measurements across those disaggregated groups. We need to separate those so we can see how did that affect the different groups. And then we can compare those differences. And when usually we compare a specified group compared to a comparator group, and usually that historically has been we're comparing how a group is doing compared to the white population because they were the majority population. Well, in that 15-16 data, they are 49% of the population, so students of color actually are larger in number than that. But for a different reason altogether, the feds are really recommending, and we recommend this as well, that maybe we should be looking at the group of all the other students in the school. Instead of comparing to the white population, why are we not comparing it to what it looks like for this group compared to everybody else in the school? And if we were looking at Native students, it would be the Native students compared to everybody in the school that didn't identify as Native. And we need to use multiple metrics. Because if you don't, we could look at those 7 groups and say, hey, every one of those groups has 25%. I guarantee you'll never see anything more equitable than that. 25%. If each one of those groups had 25%, whether it's identification for special education, opportunity to be in advanced placement class, discipline referrals, or suspensions, if you had 25%, we'd look across that and say every one of those groups is equal. That looks fairly fair. But what if some groups had a lot of referrals? Or what if some had significantly different consequences? Then we start to see. That's why we need to use more than one metric. You can hide what's going on if you only look at one metric. And besides, if you're looking at that first metric, 25%, think about it in August. How many students have a referral when we come back? Nobody. The first week of school, we might have a few. By September, by October, by November, we have some. By February, we have a bunch, and by May, we have a whole bunch. It grows as we go along. The data guide recommends we use these top four: the risk index, the risk ratio. Those are relative measures. We're kind of comparing them to each other. And then some composition measures, because these will talk about what it looks like for this group compared to the proportion of the total school enrollment. So we'll talk about those as well. And we will, when we rebuild and redo the data guide, we'll add this next one in here, an absolute measure. The first one, the risk index. This is just like that 25% across the way. What percent of all the students in this group have an outcome? Whatever the outcome is. Could be discipline referral, could be suspension, could be identification for advanced placement. And how are we going to do that? It was funny when she talked this morning, talked about math, and get a little math phobic. You need to do some division. And all you're going to divide is the number that have that outcome that we're talking about, discipline referrals, compared to the total number within there. You could do this by hand. You could create a spreadsheet. I'd recommend if you don't have the things, at least use the spreadsheet, and then you come back and address it in the spreadsheet. Or you could use an automated program. This would be what a data table from, this is the Swiss data table. But look at this. You can see up here, we have 3 native students that have a referral out of the 6. 3 divided by 6 is 50%. 103 white students have a referral compared to the 300 that are enrolled. So 34.3%, that's the risk index. We could look at these numbers all day long, or however far we wanted to, and put them in order and try to compare them. It's probably a lot easier to look at it in some kind of graphic formation. This would be the Swiss graph. Doesn't matter who does the graph. You do a spreadsheet, you can make the graph. But on that graph, it's simply telling us what percentage of each one of the groups. And right away we can see, some groups seem to have a different level, a higher risk index than other groups. And at the bottom, we want to make sure that we remember how large those groups are, because remember, there were 3 students over here in the native population that had a referral. That gave them 50%. 3 of the 300 would be 1%. It'd be right about where the red line is. So it makes a big difference when we're looking at risk index, how many people are actually in the group. We have to monitor, we call that the N, how big the number in the group is. So that brings us to metric number 2. If you have questions along the way, go ahead and ask them, but otherwise I'm just going to keep going as fast as I can to get through as much as I can. The risk index of one group divided by the risk index of another group. Remember that 25% all the way across? 25% divided by 25% would be 1. That would be equitable, it would be equal. So how we calculate, we're going to do some division again, but this time we're going to divide those decimals. We're going to divide the risk index of whatever group we're talking about by the risk index of a comparison group. If it's 1, that 25% across there. But what if one of those groups had 50% of their students had that outcome? 50% divided by 25% is 2. It's twice as likely, 200%. If it's less than 1, if one of the groups had 10, that'd be 40%. So it'd be less likely that they're going to get that outcome. Look at this. I put risk ratio calculator in Google. I got to point this out. 727, 750,000 results in less than half a second. And one of those is this one, the free risk ratio calculator that you can get. You don't have to use Swiss. You can use any item you want to. Risk ratio calculator from Wisconsin allows you to do this. You just put in your student population for each of the groups, tell how many referrals they have, it automatically calculates your risk index. And then it calculates the risk ratio for each of the groups compared to the white population. Now, on this one, it's always going to be, you're never going to know what the risk ratio is for the white students because it's always going to be 1 because you're comparing it to 1. Wisconsin should fix this. The calculation could be done so they could do it compared to all the other students in the schools, and that's what we would recommend, and that's what the feds are recommending. And look at that, they give us a graph. It looks just like that Swiss graph. You can do the same thing in your spreadsheet. You can create that same graph, but it makes it very easy instead of looking at those numbers as we went across there to look at a graph which explains and makes it real easy to see what's going on. Some of these groups have a significantly higher group than other groups, right? A significant higher result than other groups. The nice thing about this is that was for referrals. They also let you do the suspensions, expulsions, success on reading assessment, success on math assessment. Free from Wisconsin RTI Center. So it's not just a commercial about that. So what does this mean? Well, really, the risk ratio tells us how much more or less likely it is for this outcome to happen. Okay? And remember, one would be equal. So remember, we had those native students at 50%, and our white students were at 34%. If you do that division, it's 1.46, and it goes on for a long ways. Swiss would round it off for you, or you can say it's 1.46. So we would read this as saying, in this school, the native students are 1.46 times more likely to receive an office discipline referral than the white students. 0.46 times more likely. If it was 50% more likely that my daughter was going to get a referral at this school than your daughter, I'm going to probably be talking to school about saying, why is that? What can we do? How do we, why is this that inequitable? 50% more likely that my daughter, based on the color of her skin, is getting a referral compared to your daughter? That doesn't seem right. We can do something about that, can't we? I would say we should be able to at least 50%. So is 1.46 bad? Well, we know 1 would be equitable. So what's bad? 1.01? That'd be really good. If you could get it down to 1.01, kudos to you. 1.5, 2, 3, 4. What we're talking about here is what's the threshold for bad, and the name for this is what is significant disproportionality. Not just that it's disparate or disproportionate, but what's significant disproportionality. Now, actually, all schools, districts, states have to report this already. They have to report for special education what their significant disproportionality is. But there's no threshold. The feds don't say, this is what it should be and this is what's bad. In fact, since 2006, every state was able to choose how they were going to calculate significant disproportionality on their own. They got to look at their own methodology. They got to figure out how they were going to calculate it. And they got to figure out the criteria, the threshold for significant disproportionality. In 2013, the Governmental Accountability Office came out with this document that said, when we left it to the states, looking at the 10-11 data, 356 districts in the nation's 17,000 districts, about 2%, said they had significant disproportionality. Think about that. Just think about that for a second. Go back to that map. Remember the difference between all students and black students? That looked like a little bit more than 2% of the school districts in the nation to you. Looked like a heck of a lot more than that to me. 2%. Yes. Question. That would, if you can't make the comparison, if it's white, they won't report it, and they won't report if the number's under 10. They won't identify it because it'd be too easy to identify the student. If there was only 3 students in there, you said it was in the 4th grade or something like that, it would be too easy to identify that student. So they will give a report if the students are there, but they won't report based on the N.
So that would be true for the black or the white students. So there's not a significant number of white students as well in these purple areas?
I would have to see the report you're talking about. It's conceivable that it's like southern Texas, which is 98% Hispanic, or down in the Four Corners area, which might be 98% Native, something like that. It's possible, but unlikely that you have no white or black students in this school. By the way, that 15-16 data, 49% of the students are white, 25% were Hispanic, 15% were African American, and I can't remember, I think it was around 5%, maybe 8%, 5% for the Native students was the next one. No, Asian students and then Native students. Oops, go back one. So 45, when they left it to those states, 45 states used some form of that risk ratio. They did that. They did the risk index for each of the groups and then created some form. I say some form because they had mathematical tweaks in there to be able to report a number. They used some form of it, but look at this. 7 states said it had to be at least 3 times before they were 3 times as bad. I was going to be upset if it was 1.5 times as bad. They said it had to be 3 times as bad. Unfortunately, 16 states said it had to be 4 times as bad, and another 7 said it had to be 5 times as bad before we said this is significant. 5 times as bad before we're going to say the things we're doing to that group of kids isn't really significant unless it's 5 times as bad than what these guys get. That it seems atrocious to me. Well, that means that almost half the nation, 23 states, it had to be 4 times as bad or greater. Oops. So during the spring of the last administration, during the spring before they ended, they said, we got to do something about this. And so they said, we want input on methodology and criteria for identification of significant disproportionality related to IDEA. So how we're going to identify students in special ed and the environments in which they live. Now, the reason I keep bringing up special ed, it's the one place that the feds can mandate for everything. The feds don't, we're site-based, local control, state control, districts control what goes on in education, general education, for the most part. The feds can mandate what happens to special ed, but we take those special education things and we kind of generalize those eventually over into the general population. So identification for special education, that makes sense. Where they are, how much of their time they're spending in the regular ed classroom, that makes sense. Come on, next one. Discipline incidents. What's happening to these students? And suspension and expulsion. This will be generalized to our population, so that's why it's so important. The feds were asking, we need this information. This will eventually drive what we're doing in schools, so they will be reporting on this. They'll have to report on the significant disproportionality in special education, but they'll be looking at what's this look like in our schools, in our districts. Well, they didn't define a threshold, but they said everybody from now on needs to use one methodology, and that methodology is we're going to use the risk ratio for all other students, which means, and they said if you have a reasonable threshold, you better be able to defend why you're choosing that number. So if you're coming up with 5, you better be able to say why you're going to have 5, why that's a reasonable threshold. And I mean, this is already in place already, but if you have 3 years reporting 3 years of significant disproportionality, then you have to take the money that the feds give you for special education, for the 12% of the students that they say you have in special education and you really have 14 or 15, but you have to take 15% of that special ed funding and use it to attend to comprehensive coordinated early intervening services to attend to this disproportionality. So you got to take 15% of your fed money for special education and attend to disproportionality. But we know if we have these services going for special ed students, we can't just stop doing those services. We're responsible to maintain those services, which means we have to take from our general budget to cover the 15% that we took away from our special ed, because we had to take that money to cover the part because we're allowing this significant disproportionality to happen. Which means now our budget is even 15% of the special ed funding lower than it was. We're concerned we don't have enough resources as it is. You do this for 3 years. Well, unfortunately in July of last year, I think it's unfortunate, but in July of last year, the new administration said, well, this was supposed to go into effect as of September of 2018. These rules would have been in effect as of this fall. DeVos and company said, we're going to put this on hold for 2 years while we look at it and see if this is really important. 1964, we passed the Civil Rights Act. Is this really important? 5 years, 5 decades of research on this. It says it does exist. We can look at it. We can see it exists. I can show you all those resources again, or all those maps again. But schools are still required to report this, but they can implement the things that they put in place, or they can wait for the 2 years to wait till what the new ruling is. Well, immediately when they heard that this was happening, there was a bunch of states that said, no, this is too valuable, too important to ignore this. We're going forward with it. We have a plan in place. Well, these are the 15 states that said they were. I was kind of proud that Oregon was one of those states that said, we're going to go forward with this. California is going forward with it. They're not on here. Nevada, I was very happy to see that Nevada was on here. They said they were going forward with it. I've been trying to find out what the latest on that is, but I haven't heard, and I was asking some of your team about what that is. When they released this, the Fed said, this is what it would look if you used the number 2 times as bad. If you use the number 2 times as bad, about 47% of the nation's districts would have significant disproportionality. Immediately, 47, almost half of the nation's district. Instead of 2%, that's where the red line is, 2%, we would have about half the nation's districts would have to be reporting significant disproportionality, which means if it did it for 3 years, they would have to lose that 15% of their money. This is Nevada's, you're at about 78%. I didn't do the calculation, I was gonna calculate that and see which part of how many of the, what would be 80% of the 17 counties. Oops, wrong direction. Well, so what should be a reasonable goal? I would suggest that if we said, we're gonna get better than we were last year, that would be at least a commendable effort. We wanna be better than we were before. We wanna be better than we were last month. We wanna be better than we were last week. It's a commendable goal to say we're gonna at least get better. You could look at the districts around you. You could look at the districts across the state. We did this looking back on the 11 and 12 data and looked across there and we said, the median risk ratio would have been for African-American students compared to white, where each school had at least 10 of those populations in it. We can make that comparison. It would have been 1.84 times. That would have been the median, the 50th percentile. 25th percentile would have been 1.38. Remember, I was going to be upset at 1.50. That'd be better than 1.50. The only place the feds use a threshold is this thing in equal employment opportunity, and it's called the disparate impact. And they use the 4/5 rule. So if it's 1.25, if it's 0.25 times more likely, 25% more likely that the females in the state of Nevada are going to get paid less than the males teachers in the state of Nevada, then that would be a disparate impact. So the only one place where the feds actually use a threshold around this is in equal employment opportunity. Well, this is what the TA Center has kind of settled on. We've said 1.25, maybe that should be our goal. Well, I gotta tell you, that's gonna be a lofty goal. For we can get everybody to 1.25, we'd be changing the society. Maybe we wait to see what the significant threshold is from the states. I checked, and we haven't found out yet what it is from Nevada. I mentioned California. I know that California will announce later this month. I believe they'll announce later this month. I know they have a meeting that's going to discuss this. They believe that they're going to settle on 3 in California. And they realize that saying 3, and it will still identify at least 75% of all the districts in California. But they said they're gonna go forward with it as well. So the risk ratio, we can do that same kind of a comparison, put it on a graph, and we'd have that. At the top, we recommend at the Technical Assistance Center that we would use a comparison to all other students. We still say, make sure you consider the size of the population groups because that's gonna be really important. So we've seen the 2 relative measures. I'm gonna make these go as fast as I can. Now we wanna talk about those comparative composition measures. These are really gonna tell us about the context, the proportionality for each of the groups. And what it's gonna ask is, the first one we'll say is students with referrals. And the first thing we're gonna look at is one subgroup's percentage of the school enrollment, whatever percentage of school enrollment are you, should be somewhat similar, you would think, to the percentage of the students who have office discipline referrals. Now, in this case, it's not going to matter if you have 1 or more referrals. Billy has 1, Bobby has 15. Together, they are 2 students within that subgroup that have referrals. So each subgroup's, what we're really asking is each subgroup's percent of the students with ODRs, is that equal to their percent of the school enrollment? And we're going to do the same thing. Here we can do it really quickly. Here we have 100 Latino students. Of the 504 students, that makes about 19.84. We'll round that off to 20%. There's 40 of those that have referrals. Of the 195 students with referrals, that rounds off to about 21%. And we can see it over here. That's too small and it's behind the box for some of you, so we'll make it larger. 20 compared to 21. That looks somewhat equitable. That seems equitable. These seem, oops, jumping in. These seem equitable, or nearly so. This seems nearly so. This seems nearly so. But next to it, 13% of the population has 24% of the students with referrals. That does not seem equitable. That would be significant disproportionality. At the same time, across the way, we have 60% of the population with only 53% of the students with referrals and 4% with none. So we start to see these disparate conditions, these different conditions for different groups of students. And the last metric, at least we'll get all the metrics covered. The last metric is what we would say total referrals, because remember before it didn't matter how many referrals you had? Well, this one it will. It's the subgroup's percentage of the school enrollment again, just like before, compared to their percentage of all the referrals that have been written. Now it matters how many. Billy had 1, Bobby had 15. Together they have at least 16 referrals for their group. So it's important. This is why it's important to measure and look at several different metrics so that we make sure that we're looking at things we already know are valid and reliable, and they're going to tell us the story about what's going on in the school. So we're looking to see is the subgroup's percent of the student enrollment equal to their percent of all the referrals that have been written. And we can do that same thing again. Here's our Latino students. They're 20% of the population. There are 155 of the 666 referrals for about 23% of all the referrals that have been written. And we can see that over there. Now we see a little bit of difference. I'll do it, make it bigger. We notice that there's some difference there. When we see the difference between these two graphs, we know that this group's getting a lot of multiple referrals as well. And we still have that one right next to them for that overrepresentation. And across the way, we still have those groups that have underrepresentation. By the way, since both of those, the green bars and the blue bars have to add up to 100%, wherever you have overrepresentation, you have to have underrepresentation somewhere else. So we've seen those, and I mentioned that we would look at one more, and that one's the absolute measure, and it's an easy calculation. We're just going to divide how many referrals by the number of students in the group. So the African-American students have 143 referrals, 65 students for 2.20 ODRs per student. White students have 1.18. The school average is 1.32. You can look at that and say 1.32 referrals per student is too high. We want to make a goal to say we want that lower, and we want anything above that number to come down as well. They don't have the other ones to come up. So we've looked at, is there a problem? And we've cited these things. You have to use multiple metrics. You need to set some goals. What are the goals we're going to use? Well, you might want to look and see where you were previously and say, can we get any better than we currently are? We might want to look at state and national norms. We might want to look at a logical criterion. I said this is the one the TA Center is set on. It's not like we're hard flag in the sand or anything or a hard line. But that's a goal that the TA Centers together said, let's look at this and say this should be something we can work toward. Or we might wait for the state's reasonable threshold and see what they come up with. And I'm sorry that I don't have that information for what Nevada is leaning towards. So then the next thing we need to do is look at why is it happening, part 2. Why is it happening? We want to analyze the situation. We want to look for the underlying causes, but we have to focus on the things we can change. We can't, well, you know, this is a really mobile group of kids. We're a really low-income area. We're 95% free and reduced lunch. Most of our students don't have 2 parents. Billy stays home to take care of his little brothers and sisters. Mom's working 3 jobs and dad's not in the house. Those kind of things. We can't change any of those things. What we can change is our school environment, the efforts we make to make it more safe, more predictable, better environment for students in the learning situations they face every day. First thing we want to do is look at our PBIS implementation. How well is that going? We can use the PBIS assessment measurement to get there. Are we that close? People are starting to move outside. What time is it? It's empty, and I'll keep going. I don't want to keep you from going to your next session, though. What time is it? 2:20? Oh, I got 10 minutes. Oh, I won't get through, but I got 10 minutes. I just saw people moving out in the hallway. I was starting to worry. We can also think about what else do we have going on in our school other than just the discipline. What about our academic placement? How effective is our instruction to meet the needs of the students that are in there, no matter what level they are? What about our attendance rate? What about our school climate? What's our perception of school climate? By the way, PBS assessment already has the student climate assessment in there. You can look at elementary students or you can look at secondary level students. As of January, we'll also have in there, you can ask your staff what their perception of the school climate is, and you can ask parents what their perception of the school climate is. So you'll have the ability to use PBIS assessment to measure students' perception, staff's perception, parents' perception of your school climate. We can look at our graduation or our grade promotion rates to see how well those are going. And we can look for patterns of bias. Now, usually here I have another 15 to 20 minutes on just bias and information about that. It's an important part, and it definitely has its impact. But I'm going to have to skip that part in order to get there. So then we have to determine what is it we're going to do. How are we going to attend to this? What can we do to attend to it? When we do that, we want to come back and we want to focus on the things we can. And we need to determine what are the activities, the strategies, the tasks we're going to do to address the problem. When we make those kind of things, we call it an action plan. We identify those things that we're going to do. More importantly, who is going to be responsible for what and when is it supposed to be done? Never make an action plan that doesn't have these three components. Who, what, and when. How's it going to be attended to? And Kent mentioned it earlier today, Nancy mentioned it earlier today, publish your action plan where everybody knows what it is we're trying to do, how we're going to go about improving it. If we do that, then we improve our accountability. We help build the accountability around that. So here's some things we can do around that. These are the things that are mentioned. First of all, we want to look at and share our disproportionality data. Now, there's a lot of people who have the ability to see, that use SWIS, that have the ability to see their disproportionality data. They can go to those 4 metrics that I just showed you, and they saw those once, and they want to close the book, and they hope nobody else finds out. Shame on us if that's how we're handling this. Because if we know it, and we're trying to hide it, we're not being very transparent, it's there, it's a reality. If we know it, get on top of it, acknowledge it, and work to make it better. Hiding it, I would say, makes you culpable. We want to also look at our implementation effort. What's our PBIS implementation? What do we have? Do we have the core features in place? Does PBS, if our TFI report says we're doing really well, where can we improve? And it says we're not doing really well, then what are we going to do to fix those things that we can? Do we have parent and family input on the expectations we have in our school? Do we understand at the school how different it is for our students at home? Can't mention this as well. Are our expectations at school culturally appropriate for the students within our school? It doesn't mean we need to change them. It just means we need that input so we better understand the expectation or difference between those expectations between home and school. And what about our academic achievement gap? Where are we successfully and where are we not making the successes we want? One of those documents, Reaction to Prevention, is one of the ones in the bibliography. Dan Lowson and Russ Skiba, I mentioned them before, say you can do at least these 3 things. Build better student-teacher relationships, work on giving kids the emotional skill set, the advantage that they can have in understanding social emotional learning, and give them the structural interventions. What's our disciplinary system look like? Can we reduce the use of our exclusionary consequences? Can we reduce the disparities in that disproportionality? And some things we can do around that. I did skip one. Went the wrong way. And another one in that discipline disparities series, interventions. Ann Gregory and her group wrote, here's things we can do to prevent it, and here's things we can do to intervene. Look at the first thing she has in prevention. Build supportive relationships with our students. Improve the relationship our teachers have with the students. Work towards academic rigor. Explicit instruction aimed at students where they really are best able to attain that new learning. Culturally relevant and responsive teaching. Getting that family input, understanding what their cultural background looks like and how it's relevant to what we're asking in our school. Make sure that our classrooms and our schools are bias-free environments. It will never be bias-free because we all have implicit bias. Our implicit biases. Everybody has them, even those that are affected by it. Well, the most common bias, by the way, is age. And I'll guarantee you every one of us has grown about the bias that even those who are elders, our elders, say and do things that we go, oh my gosh, don't say that. They have their biases as well, and we know it, and we have ours. Conflict intervention, things we can do to intervene, find out what the cause is going on, what can we do to deal with the discipline issues, our approaches to discipline. Recognizing family and community voice in our expectations, and reintegrating students after an exclusionary consequence. That brings us to the evaluation section. We need to regularly assess, and the first thing you want to assess, and you want to assess on a monthly basis, is the action plan we have in place. We said we're going to do this, who, what, when, where's going to be successful. How are we going to do those things? Check first the action plan you had in place and see what progress we made, what do we need to do, how do we need to do differently to be successful in that. What's our PBIS implementation doing? How are we doing on implementing PBIS? Look at the metrics we used in step 1 and the goals that we had determined. How far are we away? What do we need to do differently? And broadcast the outcomes of that. Share it with your relevant stakeholders. Share it with the rest of your staff. Share it with your families. Share it with the district leadership. And plan on what you're going to do next. This is what we saw. This is how we went about to change it. And this is the outcome for that. How often are you going to do this? You should be assessing your action plan on a regular basis. Every month you come back. These are the things we said we were going to do. Did we get those done? You should probably look at maybe assessing disproportionality on more like a quarterly basis. It will be slow to move. Metrics may be resistant to rapid change. Don't rely just upon that risk index because it starts at 0 and will get bigger as the year goes throughout. Be careful of those small n's that we talked about, 6 compared to 300. Use multiple measures so that make sure that we're covering it in a bunch of different ways. And we get to the end, and really what we're saying is measure, plan on intervention, do that intervention with implement that intervention with fidelity, then come back and monitor how well did it go, where do we stand now, do we still have a problem? And with that, well, there's some more things you can get from resources you can get from PBS apps. You can always use the search bar, look up anything that we're talking about. You can look at our frequently asked questions. You can email us with a question. You can phone us with a direct question. You can look at the video tutorials, the user guides and materials, the training materials and webinars we have online. And those are all free. And you can contact us at any time. And with that, I got through almost in time. Thank you.